Of the 5 principal American fighters flown during World War II, the P-38 Lightning, P-39 Airacobra, P-40 Warhawk, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, only one has no pilot reunion association. Only one is excluded from the Fighter Memorial at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Only one was so despised by American pilots that they requested transfers rather than fly it into combat. That aircraft was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. American pilots called it the Iron Dog. British pilots flew it on exactly one combat mission before withdrawing it from service entirely. When the first U.S. Army Air Force fighter groups arrived in England in summer 1942, the Royal Air Force convinced them to leave their P-39s behind and use British Spitfires instead. The message was clear. Even second-hand Spitfires were preferable to brand-new American Airacobras. Yet pilots flying the P-39 Airacobra achieved the highest scores of any aviators operating an American aircraft during World War II. The second highest scoring Allied ace of the entire war flew the P-39. The third highest scoring Soviet ace flew the P-39. 4 of the top 6 Soviet aces scored the majority of their victories in the despised American fighter, and they achieved these results not against inferior opposition, but against the same German pilots flying the same Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 that dominated European skies. The paradox was absolute. The same aircraft, the same enemy, completely opposite results. What did Soviet pilots understand that American and British pilots missed? And why did an aircraft considered worthless in Western hands become a weapon that German forces learned to fear above all others? The P-39's problems began before the first production model left the factory. Bell Aircraft Corporation designed the XP-39 prototype with an innovative layout. Engine mounted behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a 10-foot shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. The configuration allowed a 37mm cannon to fire through the propeller hub, delivering devastating firepower. And the prototype, equipped with a turbo supercharger, achieved respectable performance, 380 miles per hour with good high-altitude capability. But the U.S. Army Air Corps demanded more speed. Bell engineers searched for ways to reduce drag. The solution they chose would doom the aircraft's prospects as a frontline fighter. They removed the turbo supercharger and its associated air scoop. The modification reduced drag and increased top speed slightly. It also made the P-39 handle, in the words of test pilots, like a brick above 15,000 feet. By 1941, as the P-39 entered production, its fundamental flaw was undeniable. Without the turbo supercharger, the aircraft's single-stage supercharger couldn't compress enough air for the engine to perform at altitude. Above 12,000 feet, power dropped dramatically. Above 15,000 feet, the P-39 became nearly helpless. And in the European theater, where American bombers would soon conduct raids at 25,000 feet, and German fighters climbed even higher to intercept them, the P-39's altitude ceiling made it operationally useless. The altitude problem was only the beginning. The mid-fuselage engine placement pushed the center of gravity rearward. Once the 37mm cannon in the nose expended its ammunition, removing weight from the front, the P-39 became prone to vicious flat spins that killed pilots who couldn't recover in time. The cannon itself jammed frequently, often after only 2 or 3 rounds. Gun fumes leaked into the cockpit during firing. The car-style doors, while comfortable on the ground, made emergency bailout dangerous. Pilots risked striking the tail. American pilots flying P-39s in the Pacific Theater against Japanese forces faced additional problems. The short range of 430 miles on internal fuel limited effectiveness across the vast Pacific distances. The slow climb rate meant P-39s struggled to intercept high-flying Japanese bombers, and while the aircraft could outroll the A-6M0, it couldn't match the Japanese fighters' legendary maneuverability in turning combat. Lieutenant Colonel Boyd "Buzz" Wagner evaluated the P-39 after early combat in the Philippines. His assessment was damning. The Zero could outmaneuver, outclimb, and out-accelerate the P-39. The P-39 was faster than the Zero only at sea level. He rated it merely 10% better than the P-40 Warhawk in most performance categories. His report listed 8 serious flaws: unreliable guns, lack of engine armor, leaky propellers, weak undercarriage, poor performance above 18,000 feet, and critically insufficient range. The British experience was even worse. When the Royal Air Force took delivery of P-39s in mid-1941, tests at the Royal Aircraft Establishment revealed performance markedly inferior to expectations. The Airacobra was slower than both the Hurricane and Spitfire. Its high-altitude performance was disastrous, and the cockpit layout was criticized as dangerous. The pilot would have difficulty bailing out in an emergency because the cockpit roof couldn't be jettisoned. In heavy rain, forward visibility was completely obliterated. Only 601 City of London Squadron operated the Airacobra. They flew one combat mission. Then the type was withdrawn from British service entirely. The RAF was so unimpressed that they immediately offered their remaining P-39s to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. When Soviet representatives arrived to inspect the aircraft, they expected to receive another unwanted hand-me-down from allies who kept the best equipment for themselves. Winter 1941-42. The first 212 Airacobras, British cast-offs, arrived at Murmansk via Arctic convoy. Soviet test pilots spent months evaluating the strange American fighter. They confirmed the spin problems American and British pilots had reported. They struggled with the radios. For many Soviet pilots, this was the first aircraft they'd flown equipped with radio communications. The Allison V 1710 engine didn't respond well to Russian cold, often cutting out in sub-zero temperatures. But Soviet pilots also discovered something Western aviators had missed. At low and medium altitudes, between 3,000 and 6,000 meters, the P-39's performance was excellent. The unusual design with the engine behind the pilot provided exceptional speed and maneuverability below 15,000 feet. The 37mm cannon, which American pilots complained jammed constantly, worked reliably in Soviet hands with proper maintenance. The heavy armament, 37mm cannon plus 2.50 caliber nose guns and 4.30 caliber wing guns, delivered devastating firepower. Most importantly, Soviet pilots recognized that the P-39's weaknesses didn't matter on the Eastern Front. There was no strategic bombing campaign requiring high-altitude bomber escort. There were no missions flown at 25,000 feet. Air combat on the Eastern Front occurred at exactly the altitudes where the P-39 performed best. The aircraft wasn't flawed. It was simply being used for the wrong mission in the wrong theater by American and British forces. January 1943. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, already one of the most distinguished units in Soviet service, converted from Yak-1 fighters to P-39 Airacobras. Among the pilots making the transition was 29-year-old Senior Lieutenant Alexander Pokryshkin, who had already scored nearly 20 victories flying MiG-3 and Yak-1. Pokryshkin approached the American fighter with the analytical mindset that characterized his entire career. He studied its capabilities systematically, testing performance at different altitudes, evaluating weapons effectiveness, developing tactics specifically designed for the P-39's strengths. Pokryshkin made immediate modifications. He connected all the aircraft's weapons, the 37mm cannon, the .50 caliber nose guns, and the .30 caliber wing guns, to fire simultaneously rather than separately. The combined firepower created what he described as a devastating blast that could destroy any enemy aircraft with a single burst. The modification spread rapidly through Soviet P-39 units as other pilots recognized its effectiveness. But Pokryshkin's most important contribution wasn't mechanical, it was tactical. Prevailing Soviet doctrine called for fighters to circle over assigned areas at low speed, waiting for enemy aircraft to appear. The static defensive posture made Soviet fighters easy prey for aggressive German pilots. Pokryshkin recognized the problem immediately and developed new methods emphasizing what he called speed, altitude, maneuver, and fire. His dynamic approach transformed Soviet fighter tactics across the entire Eastern Front. Spring 1943. The 16th Guards Fighter Regiment deployed to the Kuban region in southern Russia as part of the 216th Fighter Division. The Battle of Kuban would become the first major test of Soviet P-39 tactics against the Luftwaffe. German forces committed substantial air assets to support ground operations. Soviet commanders positioned mobile radar stations and ground controllers to direct P-39 formations against incoming German strikes. Pokryshkin's pendulum flight pattern, stacking different aircraft types at different altitudes, provided coverage across the entire threat spectrum. April 29, 1943. 8 P-39 Airacobras, led by Pokryshkin, intercepted 3 squadrons of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The German formation was attacking Soviet ground forces. Pokryshkin's tactics worked exactly as designed. The P-39s dove from altitude, achieving high speed before engaging. The 37mm cannons proved devastating against the Stukas. Pokryshkin personally destroyed 5 German aircraft in the single engagement. Some sources say 5 Stukas, others report a mix of bombers and fighters. The result stunned observers. 12 German aircraft destroyed, not a single Soviet fighter lost. The action demonstrated everything Western pilots claimed was impossible. The P-39, supposedly inferior to German fighters, had dominated a mixed formation of bombers and escorts. The 37mm cannon, which American pilots said was useless in air combat, had destroyed aircraft with single hits. The tactics Pokryshkin developed specifically for the P-39's capabilities had overcome every theoretical disadvantage. On May 24, 1943, Alexander Pokryshkin was awarded his first Hero of the Soviet Union decoration for 12 solo victories and 2 shared kills throughout 1940 sorties. He received the honor flying P-39N0 tail number 429004, painted white with the tactical number 100 on the fuselage. That white P-39 with 100 on its side would become the most feared aircraft marking on the Eastern Front. German radio operators began broadcasting warnings when Pokryshkin's formation appeared. Achtung! Achtung! Pokryshkin in der Luft! Attention! Attention! Pokryshkin in the air! Luftwaffe pilots were instructed to exercise extreme caution and avoid protracted engagements. Junior pilots were ordered to return to base immediately rather than face the white P-39. No other Allied pilot generated such systematic fear among German forces. Pokryshkin's wingman in the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment was another exceptional pilot flying the P-39, Grigory Reshkalov. Born in February 1920, Reshkalov had begun the war flying the obsolete Y-153 biplane. He'd been wounded in July 1941 and returned to combat in April 1942. The transition to the P-39 in January 1943 transformed his effectiveness. Reshkalov developed a specialty in what Soviet pilots called free hunting, independent patrols at high altitude, using exceptional eyesight to locate German formations before they reached Soviet positions. Reshkalov's personality contrasted sharply with Pokryshkin's analytical discipline. He was regarded as courageous and candid, but also impulsive and temperamental. In some situations, he followed orders with precision. In others, he would abandon the mission's primary objective to pursue random enemy aircraft that caught his attention. The contradiction created friction with commanders, but also generated an impressive kill record. By May 24, 1943, the same day Pokryshkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union, Reshkalov received the same decoration for 12 solo and 2 shared victories. The third-ranking Soviet ace would ultimately be Nikolai Gulayev, who flew his first P-39 combat mission on August 9, 1943. Gulayev was the most efficient of all Soviet P-39 pilots. In exactly 12 months and 5 days of P-39 combat, he destroyed 41 German aircraft. No other Soviet pilot scored so effectively in such a short period. Gulayev finished the war with 57 individual and 3 shared kills, making him the third highest-scoring Soviet ace. The pattern was unmistakable. Soviet pilots weren't just succeeding with the P-39, they were preferring it over alternatives. When Moscow sent directives requesting units to consider switching to Russian-built La-5 or Yak fighters, Pokryshkin and other P-39 commanders refused. They wanted to keep flying the American aircraft that Western pilots despised. The 16th Guards Fighter Regiment flew P-39s from January 1943 until the end of the war, accumulating 15 heroes of the Soviet Union, more than any other fighter regiment. Soviet mechanics made modifications that Western forces never considered. They frequently removed the wing-mounted .30 caliber machine guns to reduce weight and improve maneuverability. The guns were considered ineffective against German aircraft anyway. The 37mm cannon and .50 caliber nose guns provided sufficient firepower. The weight reduction made the already maneuverable P-39 even more agile in combat. Some pilots reported the modified aircraft could outturn early and mid-war variants of the Bf-109. The P-39 also excelled in conditions that Western pilots never encountered. The tricycle landing gear, which some American pilots derided as a training wheel and unmanly, proved invaluable on rough Soviet airfields. The P-39 could operate from soggy, snow-covered, or hastily prepared landing strips where conventional tailwheel fighters would nose over or become stuck. In the harsh Russian climate with its primitive forward airfields, this capability was essential for sustained operations. The aircraft's structural integrity impressed Soviet pilots more than any other characteristic. P-39s routinely returned from combat with damage that would have destroyed other fighters. Pilots reported aircraft with more bullet holes than intact metal in the fuselage, still flying controllably. The mid-engine design meant critical components, engine, pilot, fuel tanks, were separated rather than clustered. Damage to one area didn't automatically doom the entire aircraft. Soviet pilots developed confidence that the P-39 would bring them home even after severe battle damage. By mid-1944, the statistical picture was undeniable. The United States had produced 9,584 P-39 Airacobras. Nearly 5,000, more than half, were sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and Soviet pilots were achieving results that defied every Western assessment of the aircraft's capabilities. Alexander Pokryshkin flew 650 sorties, participated in 156 air battles, and scored 59 confirmed victories, 48 of them in the P-39. He was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the only Soviet fighter pilot to receive the honor 3 times during the war. Grigory Rechkalov flew 452 sorties, engaged in 122 dogfights, and scored 56 confirmed victories, 44 of them in the P-39. He received Hero of the Soviet Union twice. Nikolai Gulayev scored 57 victories, 41 in the P-39. The brothers Dmitry and Boris Glinka both became aces flying Airacobras. Of the top 10 Soviet aces, 5 scored the majority of their victories in the American fighter that Western pilots wouldn't fly. The explanation for the paradox wasn't mysterious. It was mathematical. Air combat on the Eastern Front occurred at altitudes between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, precisely the range where the P-39 performed optimally. The Soviet mission profile, intercepting German dive bombers and providing coverage for ground forces, required exactly the capabilities the P-39 offered. Good low-altitude speed, heavy armament effective against bombers, and structural durability for sustained low-level operations. American and British pilots needed high-altitude performance for bomber escort missions over Europe. They needed long range for operations across the Pacific. They needed fighters that could climb quickly to intercept high-flying enemy bombers. The P-39 provided none of these capabilities. It wasn't a bad aircraft. It was the wrong aircraft for Western operational requirements. But Soviet operational requirements were different. And for those specific requirements, the P-39 was nearly ideal. The tactical innovations Soviet pilots developed also made critical differences. Pokryshkin's emphasis on speed and altitude, maintaining energy advantage through the entire engagement, transformed the P-39 from a defensive patrol fighter into an aggressive interceptor. His integration of ground-based radar and controllers gave Soviet pilots information advantages that Western forces wouldn't achieve until later in the war. The pendulum tactic, stacking fighters at different altitudes, ensured that P-39s could engage enemy aircraft at optimal advantage regardless of the German formation's altitude. Even the modifications Soviet mechanics made reflected different tactical thinking. Western doctrine emphasized maximum firepower. Every gun should be installed and operational. Soviet pilots, especially those flying the P-39, recognized that excess weight was the enemy of maneuverability. Removing unnecessary guns made the aircraft more agile without significantly reducing effectiveness. The P-39's 37mm cannon and 2.50 caliber guns provided sufficient firepower. The 4.30 caliber wing guns added weight without proportional benefit. German pilots who faced P-39s on the Eastern Front learned to respect the American fighter in Soviet hands. Luftwaffe combat reports noted the P-39's effectiveness against dive bombers and the tactical competence of Soviet pilots operating the type. German fighters could defeat individual P-39s through superior high-altitude performance or numerical advantage. But against formations led by experienced pilots using proper tactics, the P-39 was as dangerous as any Soviet-built fighter. The contrast with American experience was stark. In the Pacific theater, P-39s achieved roughly 1-to-1 kill ratios against Japanese aircraft, respectable but unimpressive. In North Africa and Italy, P-39 squadrons performed adequately in ground attack roles, but were quickly transitioned to more capable fighters. No American pilot achieved ace status, 5 or more victories, flying primarily the P-39. The aircraft was relegated to training duties as soon as better fighters became available. By war's end, no American pilots wanted to discuss their time in Airacobras. But when the war ended on May 8, 1945, 1,178 P-39 Airacobras remained in active Soviet service. They hadn't been replaced. They hadn't been withdrawn. They were still flying combat missions on the last day of the war because Soviet pilots wanted to keep flying them. Pokryshkin, by then commanding the 9th Guards Fighter Division, continued flying his personal P-39 even after the rest of his division transitioned to the advanced Lavochkin La-7 fighter. He trusted the American aircraft that had carried him through 3 years of combat more than the newest Soviet design. The statistical reality was undeniable. The second highest scoring Allied ace of World War II, any air force, any theater, flew the P-39 Airacobra. 4 of the top 6 Soviet aces scored most of their victories in the P-39. The highest-scoring pilot ever to fly an American aircraft in combat, any conflict, any nationality, was Alexander Pokryshkin in his P-39. The aircraft that American and British pilots considered worthless became, in Soviet hands, one of the most effective fighters of the entire war. After the war, when American aviation historians compiled records and reunion associations formed for P-38, P-40, P-47, and P-51 pilots, no P-39 association emerged. When the Fighter Memorial was built at the Air Force Academy, the P-39 was excluded. American pilots who had flown the type preferred not to discuss it. The P-39 became the forgotten fighter, remembered primarily as an example of failed aircraft design. But in the Soviet Union, the P-39 was remembered differently. Pokryshkin wrote in his memoirs about the aircraft that had carried him to 48 victories, praising its firepower, maneuverability, and structural strength. Rechkalov described the P-39 as his favorite aircraft among all the types he'd flown during the war. Soviet veterans recalled the distinctive engine sound, the comfortable cockpit, the confidence that the aircraft would bring them home even after severe damage. The lesson wasn't about the aircraft itself. The P-39 Airacobra had real flaws: poor high-altitude performance, spin problems, short range. But it also had real strengths: good low-altitude speed, heavy armament, structural durability, excellent visibility. Whether those strengths or weaknesses mattered depended entirely on how the aircraft was used, where it operated, and what missions it performed. American and British pilots flew the P-39 in theaters and roles where its weaknesses were critical and its strengths were irrelevant. Soviet pilots flew the same aircraft in theaters and roles where its strengths were critical and its weaknesses were irrelevant. The same machine, the same enemy, completely opposite results. Not because Soviet pilots were more skilled. German aces achieved impressive scores against Soviet P-39s throughout the war, but because Soviet operational doctrine matched aircraft capabilities to mission requirements. The P-39 paradox reveals a fundamental truth about military technology. Equipment isn't inherently good or bad. It's appropriate or inappropriate for specific applications. The worst American fighter of World War II became the most effective American fighter of World War II in different hands, fighting a different war. The aircraft dismissed as worthless achieved the highest scores of any American plane in combat because it found pilots who understood how to use it and a battlefield where its unique characteristics were advantages rather than liabilities. Alexander Pokryshkin retired as Marshal of Aviation in 1981, having served the Soviet Air Force for 40 years after the war ended. He died in November 1985 at age 72. Grigory Rechkalov served until rising to Major General, passing away in December 1990. Both men spent decades after the war as instructors and theorists, teaching new generations of Soviet pilots the tactics they'd developed flying the despised American fighter that nobody else wanted. The white P-39 with 100 painted on its fuselage, Pokryshkin's aircraft that German radio operators warned about, was never shot down. It survived the entire war intact, carrying the Soviet Union's second-highest scoring ace through year after year of combat. The aircraft that American pilots called the Iron Dog and British pilots refused to fly became the symbol of Soviet air power's resurgence on the Eastern Front. And in that transformation lies the entire story of why the same machine produced such radically different results in different hands. When American engineers designed the P-39, they created an aircraft optimized for low-altitude performance with heavy nose armament. Then, American military planners assigned it to high-altitude bomber escort missions where those characteristics were useless. When Soviet pilots received the same aircraft, they assigned it to low-altitude interception missions where those exact characteristics were ideal. The aircraft hadn't changed. The mission had. And that single difference, using equipment for what it was designed to do, rather than what planners wanted it to do, transformed the P-39 from the worst American fighter to the most effective American fighter to see combat in World War II.